crap myself. I was going around West Virginia looking at third shift.
The biggest secrets during World War II, most of you probably don't even remember, was the Norden bomb site and a project called MAGIC. Now, MAGIC has been the subject of God knows how many movies, novels, documentaries. And does anybody here know what MAGIC was about? Yeah. It was the code breaking, yes. And the people who worked on that, when they were taken into the project, they were told simply, if you mention this even to your wife, we'll shoot you. It was that secret. The Norden bomb site enabled airplanes at 30,000 feet to drop a bomb down a smokestack. In the pre-computer days, it was a computer. Now, everybody thinks that the atomic bomb was the biggest secret. And it wasn't. A lot of people knew about it. One of the great legends of the science fiction world is that in 1944, a science fiction magazine came out with a story that gave all the details of the atom bomb. And the story went on that the FBI rushed around to all the newsstands and bought up all the copies of this magazine. Well, if they did that, then a copy of that magazine would be worth $100,000 today if you could find one, right? So get out your wallets. It was called Astounding Science Fiction, and it was March 1944, over a year before we started dropping atom bombs. Actually, they did not collect copies of this from the newsstands, but they did. After about 2 weeks after the magazine came out on the newsstands, the author of this story, heard a knock on his door, and it was the FBI. And they came and they said, where the hell did you get all this information? And he showed them. He had science magazines and so on, and he had put it together from stuff that had been published in obscure scientific journals and journals for physicists and things. In the 1940s, the late 1940s, 1945, the Japanese didn't have an atom bomb. So they came up with something that only the Japanese could have thought of. First of all, they discovered the jet stream. The Japanese made up balloons out of paper, and they made up these 30-foot balloons. And they had all of the teenagers and children of Japan working, making these balloons. And they launched 10,000 of them against the United States from Japan. And they were armed with bombs. And the idea was that they would fly across the Pacific on the jet stream, and they would drop their bombs on the United States. Well, these balloons were called Fugo balloons, which means fire balloons. And some of these bombs actually did reach the United States. And that's a whole other story. There are books devoted to that, written by aviation historians. When the war ended, and we discovered, well, we knew the Japanese were sending over the balloons, and just a year ago, the New York Times revealed the Japanese ultimate plan was to put diseases in these balloons, like anthrax, and send that to the United States. But they never got that far.
Very curious about, since the Pluto balloon, since it was so secret and the government didn't make any statement, how did they manage to keep it secret when they were found, when they actually...
Because, as I say, the FBI or the Army would go into where the balloon was found, and they would tell everybody, listen, we don't want the Japanese to know that this reached us. And there are books filled with pictures of all this. There are many books on this. Undoubtedly, a lot of these balloons caused some of the flying saucer sightings because they were reflective, so that they would reflect the heat of the sun. If they didn't, they would go too high and they'd explode. I've been a government consultant off and on all my life. When I was 23 years old, I was working for the Department of Army in a radio station. in the early 1970s, I took a job with HEW. The first thing that baffled me was why did it, and this is 25 years ago, why everything cost twice as much for the government. If the government was, say, buying a rubber stamp that cost you 50 cents, the government would pay $5 for the same rubber stamp. And I found out very quickly why. It costs the government so much because the government is so slow in paying. If the government buys toilet seats from a manufacturer, it takes them a year or 2 years to pay the manufacturer. And meanwhile, he's got to meet his expenses. So he charges them, instead of charging them $4.95 for a toilet seat, he charges them $500 for a toilet seat. One big project of Social Security was they put out a comic book in Spanish. And they printed 100,000 of these. And they distributed 5,000 of these comic books, which cost a fortune. It was a huge staff to put it together. And they ultimately got rid of less than 5,000 of them. Anybody have a question there?
Yeah, what were the secrets that the airport...
The secret is all money. They don't want us to know how much anything costs. They tell you that we're now building 30 stealth bombers at $1 billion a piece, but then with the cost overruns and everything when it's all... They really don't know what any of this stuff costs.
You really can't keep a good hoax down. H.L. Mencken, he wrote how the bathtub was invented and how the first bathtub was installed in the White House by Millard Fillmore. 3 or 4 times, maybe even more than that, he wrote additional pieces saying it was all a hoax, nothing was true. You can still read in guidebooks that Millard Fillmore installed the first bathtub in the White House. And the thing keeps resurfacing. And another hoax you can't keep down is Mencken wrote a story again in 1917 as to how the spirit of St. George and the bowmen who were under Henry V at Agincourt appeared at the Battle of Mons and has helped the British soldiers to escape from the German advance. It's called the Angel of Mons. And this is widely believed, although Mencken never intended it to be anything more than just a story that he dreamt up one afternoon.
There's been a tremendous amount of hoaxing within science for reasons that are not very noble. And scientists are always sort of poo-pooing many claims that, like in parapsychology or cryptozoology or whatever, that, oh, that's probably just a hoax, and they use that to dismiss it. But when a claim is made within some scientific area, very few people say, oh, that's probably just a hoax. They tend to trust each other as scientists, and as a result of that, scientists can often get away with hoaxing. There's the Piltdown case you mentioned, which is one of the classics, perhaps the classic of the century, and we still don't know who did it. Perhaps less well known is Sir Cyril Burt in Britain. Sir Cyril Burt was a psychologist who did a lot of studies, or supposedly did a lot of studies earlier in the century, and he used subjects. He had 2 researchers working with him, and he used a lot of subjects. He did a lot of work with children and with twins, and published a tremendous amount of data. And that data was so compelling that, in fact, the establishment and the British government implemented educational programs and tests. Well, we had to take that horrible 11 plus at 11, and it's all because of Sir Cyril Burt. Well, a few years ago, it turns out that the 2 colleagues who worked with Sir Cyril Burt on this never existed. They were completely fabricated people, and it turned out most of the data, a lot of it was fudged, fabricated, and Sir Cyril got knighted. He was one of the top psychologists in Britain, and there's a case in point. And there's certainly, if not hoaxing, there has certainly been and is a lot of what's called fudging. That basically the main body of your case is okay, solid, but you fudge some data just to make it more complete, to make it look more accurate. And they've even found that Galileo fudged some of his data. Basically he was right, but there was a little fudging there. And it's not just in anomalies or in Forteana.
I think ufology has probably had more hoaxes than any other Fortean field.
that extremely complicated and long-term hoaxes can be perpetrated, and it should be remembered for all other fields.
There's one going on right now with the MJ-12 papers, which is an absurd document. The MJ-12 paper has gripped the UFO community, and they've chosen sides on it. If anybody would sit down and read it word for word, they'd see it's an absurd hoax, a badly done hoax. And if they would bother to get any kind of briefing paper from the White House, and the White House will supply these, because they get 50 to 100 a week, you will see that the format and all the way it's laid out is completely wrong. Whoever did it was not only an amateur, but he was a rank amateur. He didn't know anything about the government, he didn't know anything about the military, and yet the UFO buffs have taken this MJ-12 thing to their hearts, and they're battling over it right now. And this will end up in all of the UFO books for the next 20 years as a real thing. One of Gray Barker's hoaxes, the best one probably, is the Edwards Air Force Base hoax, which you've all read about in UFO books. Gray Barker put out a memo in the form of a letter claiming that UFO had landed at Edwards Air Force Base, and the group of distinguished people, including President Eisenhower, had visited the base to talk to these UFO people. And to give himself away, Gray included in the list of famous people who went there names of all of his friends. He listed his friends. Nobody ever checked this memo out, and it's now been published around the world as one of the great UFO incidents of the 1950s. And Gray Barker, wherever he is still laughing.
There's another important issue that I want to raise. We've seen a lot of investigators in the UFO field, particularly, and other fields as well, however, who start off as excellent investigators, excellent ufologists, excellent whatever they're investigating, do high-quality work, and then years later, they start falling for these absurd hoaxes and they go off the deep end. And it's a very curious phenomenon. We're seeing more and more of it in recent years. And as I thought about this, I thought, is it a desensitization process whereby people in the field are exposed to so much strangeness, legitimate strangeness in the phenomena, that they become desensitized to it, that nothing surprises them anymore. And consequently, the outrageous elements in a hoax, they take in stride like every other strange thing that they've seen.
Professional writers usually, at some point, they study a thing that's called suspension of disbelief. When you go to a James Bond movie, you know it's garbage. You know that these things could never happen to anybody, but you accept them while you're watching the movie. And it's the same process, except sort of extended into your private life. When you're a scientist or an investigator of strange things, after a while, you've heard so many strange things that you know you believe everything.
This is a problem that has long faced people in psychical research. About 50 years ago, a man named Walter Franklin Prince wrote a really fascinating book titled The Enchanted Boundary. And his thesis was that when people come into these Fortean or paranormal areas, they sometimes lose their normal critical senses, and they pass over what is called the enchanted boundary. And this happens very, very abruptly. There's a very skeptical investigator named Eric Dingwall, who later became a member of PSYCOP. One of the most celebrated mediumistic cases in psychical research is that of Marjorie, who's a well-known fraud. Dingwall came over